Hi! In this tutorial, we will learn how to work with the Android Room library to create and manipulate internal SQLite databases in our Android applications. Previously, we were able to create our databases and our tables and manage data thanks to SQLite OpenHelper and SQLite database classes. This means entering a large amount of standard code to create and manipulate even a very small database. In addition, no compile-time verification of SQL queries was possible, and if the database schema is modified, we had to update the affected SQL queries. But now, with Jetpack libraries, we have become able to create and manipulate our internal databases in a more flexible way thanks to a Room library. The Room library provides an abstraction layer on SQLite, which allows more robust access to the database while offering all the power of SQLite. Room is an ORM, or Object Relational Mapping Library. In other words, Room will map our database objects to Java objects, or Kotlin objects, and provide an abstraction layer on SQLite to allow smooth database access while harnessing the full power of SQLite. In this tutorial, we will create a mini project for Contact Manager while discussing the basics of using the Room library and how it can improve your workflow as a developer. So, here in this new project, the first thing we must do is creating the entities. The entity usually represents a POJO class or plain old Java object. The entity represents a table in the database and must be annotated with @entity. Each entity consists of at least one field to define a primary key. Each entity needs a primary key. The primary key can be specified by adding the @primary key annotation before the concerned variable. So here we will suppose that this project will contain a database. This database contains only one table. This one table contains 3 columns. The first column is the ID of the contact, which is an integer, and it must be the primary key. The second column must be the name of the contact, and the third column must be the phone number of the contact. So here we must create a class which represents the entity of this table. So here I create a new Kotlin class which has the name of contact. So the first thing that we must do here is adding the annotation @entity. There is an error here. It's normal because we have to add some dependencies in this file, this build.reader file. Here we must add dependencies on Android build.reader file. As you can see here, we have some new dependencies, but we have to change something. Here, we must change the annotation processor with cat. And here, we must add Kotlin cat. We must sync now. We will return now to our entity class. So here we are working with Kotlins. So these entities must have three variables. A variable which represents the ID, a variable which represents the name of the contact, and a third variable which represents the phone number. So we must use the var. Here we must use an underscore before ID because we will work with a simple cursor adapter after that. This is an int. We have said before that the ID must be the primary key of our table, so we must add an annotation here, add primary key. We must add the import in this class, so import auto-generate. Here we must add auto-generate true. We can also add an annotation, not nil. Now we must add a second variable which represents the name of the contact. So we must use var name, which is a string. If we want to change the name of this column in the database, in this case we must add an annotation, add column info. We must import it, and here name we will use name underscore contact. So the name of the column in the table will be like that and not like that. Finally, we must add the final variable var phone. It's a string. And here I want a different name in the table of the database. I don't want it to have this name, so I will use add column info name phone underscore contact. We have finished the entity class. Now we must create an interface which represents the DAO, data access object. In this interface we will create functions which will execute SQL queries after that. So here I will add a new Kotlin class file. I will choose interface here. I will give it the name of contact DAO, and the first thing we must do here is adding this annotation at DAO. We must import it, and now inside this interface we must create our functions which will execute SQL queries later in our activities. So here I will create a function named insert contact this function will have a parameter which has the contact type. This is our entity class contact. We mustn't use var here, and so just contact. So here we must add an annotation, add insert. Now we will create a function to update a contact. So fan update contact. It should have a parameter of a contact type. Here we must add the annotation add update. We must import it. Now we must add a function that delete the contact. Also, it should have a parameter of type contact, which is our DAO class, our entity class. We must add here add delete annotation. And now we have to create a new function that returns all the contacts which exists in the table. So here fan getall contacts. Here we must insert a query. So add query. The query is select from our table name is contact. We will also create a function that returns only a contact by its ID. So here fan get one contact. Here we must have an ID as a parameter, and here add query select from. Here we have a clause where underscore ID, which is the ID in the table, equal. We must add this before using the name of the parameter here. And here we are. We could specify the return type of this function here. So here we have select all columns from the table contact. And we said that we will use the simple cursor adapter. So this function must return a cursor. We must import cursor. And here this function must return a contact. So we can specify its type. So here contact. Here we are. We have finished this interface. Now we must create an abstract class. This abstract class must extend the room database, and in this class we must declare our entities and the name of our database and its version. So here we will create a new class, Kotlin class. I will give it the name of app database class. We say that this class is an abstract class. We say that it must extend the room database class we must import it, and here we must create an abstract method which has the type of our DAO interface, which is contact DAO. I will give it the name of contact DAO. The type of this function is contact DAO. Contact DAO. The function that we will create now must be in a companion object. So here, companion object. I must create a variable which has the type of this class, app database, at volatile var. I will give it the name of instance. We said that it should have this type, app database. So this variable should be private, a private variable. Here we must add question mark equals nil. And now it's time to create the function fun get app data base. It should have a variable it should have a parameter which has the type of context. So I will give it the name of context. It should be context. So here this function should have this type, app database. So here app database. And now, if this variable instance is nil. So if instance equals nil. So in this case, we'll use a block synchronized app database class so here if instance equal nil, in this case instance will have room. Here we must import it, database builder room, so we must import it. Database builder. Here in the database builder we have to insert 3 parameters. The first parameter is the context, so here I will use the first parameter, context. The second parameter is our class, and the third parameter is the name of our database. The database will have the name of contacts manager. So here we must add dot build. We must return instance now. Return instance. This method should return instance. So here we must add this, the question mark here. So we must now add an annotation here at we must import it at database, and here we must declare our entities. We have only one entity, so here entities, it should be an array. Here we have only one entity is contact. Here we must add the version. We have finished now this class. It's time to create our activities. The first activity will insert the contact. The second activity will show us all the inserted contact in the database. The third activity will show the details of a selected contact from the second activity. the third activity should also give the user the opportunity to update or delete a selected contact. So here, the main activity will be dedicated to adding contacts. So in the interface of main activity, we must create two edit texts and a button. So I will convert this view to a linear layout, a vertical linear layout. Here I must put an edit text for the name. I must also add a second edit text for the phone number, and finally I must add a button add. Here I will change IDs, so here name, it should have a hint and not a text, so here contact name. The second edit text should have phone as ID, and here we must put a hint and not a text. Here the hint should be phone number, and here we have a button which should have add as a text. And now in the behavior, in the Kotlin class, the first thing that we must do is creating two variables. The first variable should have the type of app database, and the second variable should have the type of contact DL, and we will see why. So here var, I will name it app database. It should have the type of app database. It could be null. Now I will create a second variable. It should have the type of contact DL. It could be null also. And now it's time to create two edit texts and a button. So I will create two immutable variables. So I will use val and not var. Val name. This is an edit text. Equal, find the view by ID. Here r.id. The ID of the edit text is name. After that, I must create a second immutable variable, val phone, which is also an edit text. Find the view by ID, r.id.phone. Finally, I have a button. And now we must create a function which allow us to access the database. We must see that the room library doesn't permit an access to the database from the UI thread. So the database should be accessed from a thread different from the UI thread. So here I will create a function. I will give it the name of access a database. In this function, I will use those two parameters. App database our context here is this. After that, we will call this abstract function which exists in this app database class. So here and now it's time to access our database. So in the UI thread, I must create a new thread dot start. So here the first thing we must do in this thread is calling the access database function. Now we must create a new contact. This contact should be added after that in the database. This contact should be added after a click on the add button. So here we must create a new contact var co. This is the contact. We will call the constructor of our contact class. So here we have an integer, we have a name, and we have a phone. The primary key is auto-generated. So here I will use nil. Now I must add a name of a contact. The name of the contact is entered here in this edit text. So I will use name dot get text dot to string. Finally, we must add the phone number. So the phone number is entered here in this edit text. So we must do phone dot get text dot to string. Here we have a problem. Change parameter ID. This is an int. So here this question mark was added. to say that this variable could be null, because Kotlin is a null safety language. Now we have the contact here in this variable. Now we must be able to add this contact in our table in the database. So we will use add.set on click listener, and here we will call a method. We will call a method or a function. The function is insert contact. We have now a variable of this type, contact DAO, which has the name of contact DAO. I will use it now to add this contact. So contact DAO dot insert contact, and it should have this variable as a parameter. We must add the question mark here. Now we must create a second activity in which we will show all the contacts inserted in the table. So we must create a new activity. Here I will add an empty activity. It should have the name of contact list. Finish. So here we are. So after adding the contact, we must go to this activity. So here I must create an intent start activity. Here intent. We must import it. This, and our destination is contact list. Now it's time to develop the code of the second activity. In this second activity, we will show all contacts which exist in the database within a list view. So here in this interface, we must create a list view. I will convert the view at first. Now I will add a list view. This list view should have an ID. I will give it LST as ID. In the layout folder now, we must add a new file which represents the item of our list view. So here I will create a new layout resource file. I will give it the name of item. I will change the type of the root element. Here I will choose a linear layout. It will be a vertical linear layout. Here in this item, I must put a text view to show the ID of the contact. I must also put a text view to show the name, and a third text view to show the the phone number. So here, one text view, two text view, three text views. I will change IDs of those text views. So here I will change the ID by ID, here by name, and here change the ID by phone. We have finished the XML part in this for this activity. So here we must access the database. We have created a method or a function in the main activity class which allow accessing the database, which has the name access database. So I will just call this function. To do that, I must create a variable which must be an instance of the main activity class. Now I have a list view within this interface. I must create an immutable variable val ls. This is a list view. Find the view by ID r.id.lst. And now it's time to access the database. So we must create a new thread, but after that we must instantiate the main variable. So and now we are able to create a new thread dot start. We mustn't forget it. We will call access database. So here main dot access database. Now we must create a cursor. We must create a cursor. In this cursor, we must put the result obtained by this function, get all contacts. So here in this variable, we must put the result of the get all contacts function. So I must call at first this variable which exists in main activity, and after that I will call the get all contacts method or function. Here we are. Now we are ready to call the simple cursor adapter, or to create a variable with the type of simple cursor adapter, which will represent the adapter of our list view. So this work must be done inside the UI thread. So I will call the function inside this second thread, the function of run on UI thread. So here in this run on UI thread, I will create a simple cursor adapter variable. I will call it adapter. It should have the type of simple cursor adapter. I will instantiate it, simple cursor adapter. The first variable in the simple cursor adapter is the context. So this the second variable in the simple cursor adapter is the layout, which represents the item. So here we have created an XML file which has the name of item.xml, which represents the item of our list. So I will call it layout.item. Now, the third parameter is the cursor. In our case, it has the name of cursor, and which contain the result of getall contacts. Finally, the third parameter is an array of strings. In this array of strings, we should put the name of the columns. So here I will use array of. Here we must give the name of the columns. So I will use the cursor to get the name of those columns. Cursor dot get column name. I should give the index of the desired column. So here I will retrieve the ID. So the ID have the 0 as index. We must also retrieve the name of the contact. So cursor dot get column name. So the name is located in the column which has the first index 1, index 1. We must add the question mark here. And finally, we must add the phone number. So the values of those columns should be displayed in those text views which exists in the item.xml file. So this parameter should be an array of integer in which we must put the IDs of those text views which exists in item.xml. So in this parameter, we must create an array of integer, int array of. So here I must put the name or the ID of the text view in which we will display this column. So this is the ID, so I must put r.id. ID. This is the first text view in item.xml file. After that, we have to display the name. So I will call the second text view in this file. And finally, we must display the phone number. I will just check the IDs, ID, name, phone. And here, ID, name, phone. Finally, we have to add the last parameter, which is the flags. It could be 0 or 1. So we have finished the code parts for the adapter. Now it's time to call the setAdapter function for our list view. We have a list view which has the name of ls. So here I will use ls.adapter, and here I must give the name of my adapter, which is adapter. ls.setAdapter adapter. So we must now test this part of our code to see if there is something wrong. We will execute this part of this code and we will continue later. So here we are. We will put the contact's name. And the phone number. We will try to add it to the database. So I will try to insert it. There is a problem here. We will see what is the problem. So we must open the logcat. We must select error. I will execute this activity. Here there is a crash. The problem exists in main activity in this line. So, okay. This is the error. So we must call add dot set on click listener before accessing the thread. So here we must do that. We must call set on click listener before executing this thread. We will create this contact before accessing the thread also. We will try now after doing this correction. And here we are. The contact was added successfully. We'll try to add a second contact. And yes, we create the application successfully. Now it's time to develop the code of the last activity. Now, when the user click an item on this list view, it must go to the third activity. In this third activity, we must show the details of the contact. And also we must put two buttons in this activity, an update button and a delete button. So now we must create an activity, empty activity. I will give it the name of detail activity. We say that this activity will show the details of the contact and should contain two buttons. So in the interface or in the layout designed for this activity, we must put two edit texts and two buttons. So I will convert it to a vertical linear layout. I must put now two plain texts, or edit texts, and two buttons. I will change the IDs of those views. So here we will display the name. Here we will display the phone number. Here we must update the contact with this button. So update. I will change the text of this button, update, and here we must delete the contact by clicking on this button. It's time to develop the behavior of this interface now. So the first thing that we must create here in this activity is the variable which must have the type of main activity, because our method or our function which allow us to access the database exists here. So we must create a variable here of main activity type. It could be null. Here I must create immutable variables, val name. Here I must specify the type of this immutable variable, and here I must give the ID of this view. The same thing for the phone number. And finally we have, this is not the text, this is a button. So and finally we have the delete button. Delete. But here, after finishing the code of this activity, we must complete the code of contact list activity. After displaying all the contacts in the list view, we must create the code which gives the user the ability to select a contact. So here in this activity, after this instruction, we must add a new instruction, ls.set on item click listener. Set on item click listener. Here we should implement a function which has the name on item click. The on item click function has three or four parameters. The first parameter represents the adapter. The second parameter represents a view inside the clicked item. The third parameter represents the position of the selected item. And finally, the last parameter is a long integer which represents the ID of the selected item. So here we will use a lambda expression. So the first parameter, we said that it represents the adapter, it's a parent. The second parameter represents a view inside the selected item. The third parameter represents the position of the selected item, and finally a long integer which represents the ID of the selected item. So here we will use a lambda expression. It must be changed by this, and we must develop our code here. So when the user clicks on the desired item, it must go to the details activity. And in the details activity, we will call a function created in this interface which has the name getOneContact. getOneContact should have the ID of the selected contact. So here we must retrieve the ID of the selected contact, and it must go also to the detail activity. So the ID is displayed in the first text view in this item.xml file, and it has ID as an identifier. So here we must create a text view in which we will put the text view, the first text view in item.xml, which displays the ID. So here we will use after. So here we must create a variable with the type of text view, in which we will put the text view which contains the ID. So after calling find view by ID, we must use this second parameter, view dot find view dot by ID, here r.id. And now we must put the value of this text view within an extra with the intent. So here we must create an intent, var intent, the first parameter this, the second parameter the destination class, detail activity class.java. Before calling start activity, we must call put extra intent dot put extra. Put extra should have two parameters. The first parameter is a key of our choice. I will choose ID, and the second parameter is the value of this text view. So I will use t dot get text dot to string. We can call the start activity function now. Start activity intent. We have finished the whole code of this activity. Now it's time to complete the code of this activity. So here we must also create a variable in which we will retrieve the ID, var ID. It's an integer. And now we will retrieve in this variable the value of the ID of the selected contact. We will use get intent get int extra, and here we must put the key. So now we have retrieved the value of the ID of the selected contact in this variable. Now we must access our database. So here we must create a new thread. After that, we must retrieve the contact using this function, getOneContact. So we must create a variable here in which we will retrieve the contact returned by getOneContact. So we will call the method or the function getOneContact, and we will provide this ID for this parameter. Here we must convert it. And now we must display the name of this contact in this edit text, and we must also display the phone number of this contact here in this variable. So name dot set text. We will retrieve the name from this count variable dot we will call the getter here. This is a call to the getter. And now we will call the getter of the phone. We have finished this part, and we will try this code. So here we must add a new contact. There are something wrong here. We have forget something here. we forget to instantiate this variable before going inside this thread. So here, before accessing the thread, we must instantiate this variable main. Here we are. So we will try this again. And here we are. We have the name of the selected user and its phone number. Now it's time to update or delete this contact. So now we must call the set on item click listener for the update button. So outside this thread, we must type update dot set on click listener, and here we must create a new contact. This new contact should have the new values entered by the user in those edit texts. So var_c a new contact, and here phone dot it's time now to create a thread. Here, to update the contact, we must access the database. So we will call main.access database. Here we must add the question mark. After that, we can call the method, the function update contact, which exists in this interface. So here main.contact DAO.update contact, and here we must give this function our new contact. After updating the contact, we must return to the list of contacts so we can see the updates done. And finally, we must call the set on click listener for the delete button. So delete dot set on click listener. The same thing here. We must create a new thread because we must access the database. Main dot access database, and now we must call the delete contact so the desired contact to delete is this one. So it must be a global variable here. So we must declare it as a global variable. So here we have to call main dot contact DAO dot delete contact. Here we must provide the desired contact, which is compt in our case. So here we have something wrong. The delete contact, it has a contact as a parameter. So where is the problem here? It could be nil. So we must add here. This question mark, and here we are, we have no problem here. So the last thing to do is to copy this intent and paste it here, because after deleting the contact, we must return to the list of our contacts. We will execute that. So here we must add a contact. I will change something here. Contact 1. I will change the number. I will click the update button to see the result. So the update is done successfully. Here the name of the contact was changed and also the phone number. Now I will try to execute the delete button. I'll try to delete this contact, so I will click on delete button. There is something wrong. So here we forget .start to execute the thread. I will try to delete this contact. Delete. So the error was here. The error was here. So we developed the code of the setOnClickListener function for the delete button inside the setOnClickListener of the update button. That's why there was no execution. So the code of the setOnClickListener for the delete button must be here and not inside the setOnClickListener function of update. We will execute that now. As you can see here, the second contact was deleted successfully. I'll try to delete that contact also. The third contact was deleted successfully. I will delete this contact and so on.